So our chapter is on food production and food security. Big topic, host of factors that determine food security. It's access to food, is food available? Its utility, how is food used? Is it nutritious enough? Do we have a stable food supply? It includes issues such as food waste, transport, markets. All of these elements are affected. All of these sort of categories of elements of food security are affected by climate change, and they're all, of course, also affected by a range of other things. But it turns out that availability of food production is the thing that we know most about. It's the thing there's the most literature on. We have climate models that we run with crop models that tell us about what's going to happen to crop yields in the future. So I'm going to focus on that pretty much for my 7 minutes, say something about the influence of climate change on crop production. I'm going to say three things. We'll talk about three areas. The first is climate change will reduce crop yields sooner than we thought at the last IPCC assessment. Okay, so in the last assessment, 1 to 2 degrees of warming in temperate regions such as our own was thought to be beneficial for crops, but now we know that it will be detrimental in temperate regions on average. So again, that's new since the last report. A confirmation since the last report, so a repeated result, if you like, is that the tropics will be worse hit on average. So in a sense, there's a kind of double hit there. One is the climatological and the weather, the fact that they're dependent on systems that are changing and are going to be susceptible to climate change. And the other is just the difference you can see there in the agricultural systems, right? So there's an agricultural system in the UK, taken somewhere near the Big Chill Festival, and a farmer in China. And you can see, we know the systems are very different and have a different vulnerability associated with them. This is hugely important in its own right, this impact in the tropics, because, as we know, in developing countries, a higher fraction of income is spent on food, right? So there's a greater vulnerability there. So we've had a bit of debate about the issue of measuring impacts of climate change today, and certainly we can say that the true cost of climate change is more than just a few percent of GDP. It's not the kind of thing you can measure in that way. There is also an issue of interdependence here, of course. We get a lot of our food from the tropics, notably rice is an obvious example that springs to mind. So there are repercussions for us, if you like, and I'll come on more to that shortly. You'll notice in the couple of statements I just made about the tropics and temperate regions, I use the words on average and emphasise them perhaps a little bit. I think it's important to recognise that there are also opportunities associated with climate change. So the first Scottish wine grapes will be harvested this September, and that's an opportunity that probably without climate change wouldn't have come to be. Now, that's not the average picture. Those opportunities and those gains aren't the average picture, but it's important to note them. So I think it's a case of adapting to avoid the worst, but actually making the most of opportunities, I think, is an important message within agriculture. There's a growing awareness that this isn't just a distant problem. So another new thing since the last report is we're not just running computer simulation models into the future and saying, here's what we expect, here's what we expect. We've looked historically at crop yields and how climate has affected crop yields historically, and said, do these two things match up? And they do. You get about a 1 to 2% per decade climate-induced change in crop yield. So that kind of gives us more confidence in our projections. They're consistent with historical analysis. Again, growing awareness, this isn't a distant problem. You may have read in the news, ASDA recently commissioned a report, discovered that 95% of their fresh produce is already at risk from climate change. So this is an issue that business is taking seriously with regard to food and in many other areas as well. Okay, so that's the first area. Climate change will reduce crop yield sooner than we thought. Secondly, a little bit on the stability of food supply. We need a stable food supply, right? Year to year, we need stability. When production isn't stable, this recently has been manifest as food price spikes after the Russian 2010 heat wave and the drought in Australia in 2007 affected the yield of wheat, and there were very rapid increases in food prices after that, not just in wheat actually, after that. They came down to some degree, not to their previous levels afterwards. So far, stable food supply, yes, but we're being affected, the cost that we pay, at least in developed countries, the cost that we pay is changing. That's how that's having an impact. We expect more of that with climate change. That kind of variability is consistent with climate change. One of the things that came out of the chapter is that increase in year-to-year variability in crop yield. So there's a role for global markets, economics, in managing this interdependence, the different regions that are affected by climate change in different years. There's also a role for seasonal forecasting, for early warning systems. Coincidentally, I have a paper out today on the link between El Niño and the global food supply. So we can say things about managing food storage, about trade. So there are issues there. The third thing I want to talk about is adaptation. So what can we do about the problem? A key part of this is knowing when to act, acting with enough lead time. So I've just mentioned seasonal forecasting, early warning type, a few months ahead of the harvest. But what about longer term? This is one of the graphs from our chapter. Don't worry too much about the numbers. We're going left to right in groups of 20 years. The height of the bars for the red indicates the number of studies that are saying crop yield will decrease. So this is across a whole range of different crops and locations. And the blue indicates increases. So there we're getting that mixed signal, 50-50, 2010 to 2079. But pretty soon we're moving towards, this is the weight of evidence, going towards more yield decreases. And the colour's getting redder and redder, darker and darker, which means greater and greater yield decreases. Importantly, these simulations include these computer simulations include adaptation, changing crop variety, changing in irrigation, adding irrigation, fertilizer. So this is starting to tell us when we're going to need some more major transformations in agriculture. In the second half of the century onwards, we're going to need to think about doing things differently. Will this need different diets, changing production areas? This infographics is from CCAF, CCAFS. You can Google that along with IPCC. They've produced an infographic kind of version, their take on the IPCC, if you like. So I'm very nearly out of time. And just in closing, want to say a little bit about the bigger picture. Why is food a particular challenge? A growing population, more people wanting to eat meat. Meat is a less efficient use of land. There are limits to adaptation. There's only so much land, right? And we want to use it for other things, for biofuels. We want to not rely on fertilizers, which through the Haber process use natural gas. So meeting this challenge involves working together. Science, policy, NGOs, and business really working together and co-designing research and co-designing adaptation solutions. And of course, I know exactly how to do that, but I'm out of time, so I'm unable to tell you. So maybe that's something to pick up on in the questions. Okay, thank you.